Welcome to the 25th episode of Radical Priorities. I'm Aidan Clark.
I'm Ben Parkins.
Today we're going to talk about first the recent act, or it's about to be passed. The NDP have a majority in British Columbia, and they want to pass something called Bill 15. The purpose of the bill basically gives overriding powers to the NDP cabinet. That means they can override environmental regulation, they can override Indigenous consultation, and they can override many issues to do with specific regions within BC, municipalities, etc. Um, it's a similar story. We've heard it. It's sort of kind of Carney's Canada in a way. It's similar to the special economic zones that we discussed last episode with Doug Ford. This is a sort of NDP variety in that its focus is principally on providing energy independence to the province right now. They rely heavily on electricity coming from the United States, so they want to basically expand their grid by 25% in the coming years, hoping to power another 1.5 million homes. So one of the ways that they're doing this is they also want to offload a great deal of the productive effort to the private sector, which means they want businesses who might run wind farms or solar farms to sort of they will basically engage with BC Energy, Crown Corporation, and they'll sell power to the BC grid. That's, again, ostensibly the basic format for how British Columbia at the moment wants to go through. My biggest problem with it at the moment is that it's sort of, I would describe it as it's sustaining growth through consumption. When you want to expand a grid by 25%, which is crazy and not even necessarily possible, and on top of that, you have 1.5 million homes that need to be powered, right? So enormous amount of energy beyond the politics of economic independence from the Americans. You have to ask the questions around the consumption. And pretty much our economics is based upon, I would say now, growth through consumption. It's not growth through great industrial projects. Even the reliance on the private sector is emblematic, I would say, of the fact that this is not necessarily maybe a national project in the way that Carney has styled it from the perspective of the federal government. It's still very much interested in maintaining the principles of the economics that we have today, which means growth at all costs. And if you can't get growth through industry, through big industrial projects, industrial revolutions, tech revolutions, perhaps in the contemporary setting, you can maybe do so through consumption. You can massively expand the consumption demands, and then society has to adapt.
Mm-hmm.
And markets are the ultimate instrument, the ultimate technology for forcing society to forcibly adapt. Of course, whether society can or not is irrelevant to markets. It's about expanding market opportunities at any cost, and expanding consumption is I would say, a rather crude and rather expansionist way of doing this without necessarily thinking about how it aligns with society, with the environment. Um, Maybe one final note is that what's interesting about this is that the conservatives, who I would say are very critical of, certainly critical of large scale industrial growth, they want growth. They want economic growth. But they don't want the government involved. They definitely want it to be a massive private sector effort, which does skew a little bit the kind of projects that they might see themselves pursuing. In this sense, expanding the grid is still a rather top down approach, even if they
Mm-hmm.
want to rely upon the private sector entrepreneurship to help them get the job done. And yet, what's so interesting about this, of course, is that the last roadblock, I would say, for the conservatives in Canada is this issue with the scale of the spending that usually has to happen to get any big infrastructure project pushed forward, which means enormous amounts of monetary printing, massive amounts of effective economic stimulus. Now, the idea, of course, of someone like Carney, and to an extent the BC government as well, but we have a really existing industry that is ready to make use of this money, so it's not just going to contribute to inflation. But And my frustration with this is that if there is one thing that you get once you take away industrial growth in capitalism, all you're ever left with is financial growth. Finance is the core principle of capitalism. It's been there since the 16th or 15th century in the birth of modern banking in Italy. You know, that is what describes capitalist production, finance. So it's an interesting sort of asterisk to put beside critiques on the other side of these kinds of programs, let alone the big national programs of people like Carney, and to an extent the provincial programs of Doug Ford, which is, well, again, we shouldn't even there shouldn't be any kind of top-down approach. What there should be is pure private sector, get rid of all regulations. Of course, that's not worked out for Doug Ford. He has wanted to use a strong political provincial sledgehammer to get these projects forward. But in some respects, these two decisions, these choices between a consumption-fueled growth on the one hand and financial growth on the other hand, which is viewed rather ignorantly by the conservatives as if you can have financial growth without money printing, are the kind of the two bad options that appear to me out of this story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a clarifying question. So just to be clear, this is 1.5 million homes that are planned on being built in X amount of time will necessitate the grid being expanded by this much?
The focus of this bill is exclusively on infrastructure, so
Okay.
not necessarily housing infrastructure. The 1.5 million number comes from the expected number of houses that can be powered with a 25% increase to the grid, which is the sort of the focus of this particular bill.
Okay.
It's an abstract number.
Right. So it's if we increase supply by X amount, then presumably this number of homes will be built. People will be able to afford these homes. This kind of thing. Yeah, it's interesting to see that. It throws into question. I mean, there's a few things here. One of them for me that's interesting is we keep talking about how in these roundabout ways we now see oftentimes right wingers or populists end up at these kind of leftist traditionally progressive kind of policies and talking points. Here it almost feels like the opposite, where now we're seeing a bill being put forward by the NDP, correct?
Yep.
That is hey, we should be able to bunny hop essentially what is our own red tape to get things done in this way, because I think what you didn't mention, but what we've spoken about a little bit before this, was that this allows them to, in some cases, almost like the special economic zones, right? Ignore environmental regulations, ignore incorporating indigenous perspectives, which again doesn't seem like the kind of thing that a traditionally sort of progressive or what we call leftist party would do. And so once again, we sort of see the wires cross in these opposite ways, which is again, I think just more evidence that the system is in a really weird spot right now.
Definitely. And it's funny that you wouldn't necessarily describe Carney as a conservative, maybe traditionally,
Mm-hmm.
socially, but economically, fiscally, he is, and in that sense, he is more like Doug Ford sometimes, who might be more willing to attack Canada's social institutions in a way Carney would never do. For instance, judicial independence. We discussed it last episode, has recently come under rather heavy fire by Doug Ford. But another part of the story, and it's sort of really the second topic of today's episode, is this question of the status of Indigenous consultation, and what do we mean by red tape, and yeah, what do we also mean therefore by environmental regulation, maybe in terms of a broader scope of how do we enforce basic social goals when they seem to conflict with the very way that we sustain the society that would like to have these social goals. And often there's a contradiction in people's mind between the economy and social goals. We're constantly having to play one against the other. Of course, really the opposite should be true, which is that, well, surely social goals should go hand in hand with the economy. That's definitely Carney's perspective. For him, you're not really overriding regulation, you're kind of inventing provisional regulatory frameworks. So they will have technically regulatory frameworks. They're just going to be different environmental regulatory frameworks in BC that will avoid sort of what's called overlapping, right? So where you're kind of double approving a process. It's the exact same thing that Carney wants to do in the federal context. And it is worth saying that they, I mean, Bremer Elby has said two things in particular about the bill. He said, one, we're not looking to use it for pipelines. He really wants to use it for renewable energy. And secondly, he wants to avoid what are called constitutional challenges, which is if the infractions in the consultation process, like let's say the consultation process with Indigenous peoples doesn't happen at all, that is, it is open for a constitutional challenge, which means you can get in a lot of legal trouble. So what they're interested in inventing is kind of provisional processes to kind of, okay, we can address the environment, we can address Indigenous consultation, but we want to accelerate what we're able to do economically. So we need to bypass sort of sluggish social processes in order to do so, promote a new social philosophy. Again, the third option here is, well, I mean, maybe we need to emphasize society. Maybe Carney's Canada is not going to arrive because there is a really big contradiction here between the economy and even a much better social philosophy for how to do the economy. Remember that what I described as growth through consumption is very much, I would describe it as a more kind of left-leaning technocratic economic political philosophy. It's not, even though everyone wants greater consumption and greater growth and greater market domination, these kinds of broad projects of increasing consumption are so top down in terms of the policy structure and the technical nature of how they get implemented that they're not likely necessarily to be found in a sort of small government style conservative. On that note, though, Indigenous consultation is generally viewed, though, as an interruption to capital movement, right? It's an interruption to business, it's an interruption to development. So this kind of replays the debate I just sort of summarized with social goals versus economy, which is that, well, we'd like to do consultation, but it's a slow process, it's bureaucratic, again, it's red tape. And I think one of the problems here is that sort of, again, the technocrats, which I think are embodied to an extent by people like Carney, is they think that, well, but Indigenous owned businesses is the social answer, right, to how to continue economic growth and accelerating the presence of markets while also fulfilling our constitutional obligation, our obligation to reconciliation. And my problem with this is twofold. One, if you look at the specifics, and I'll use one example, in Ontario, for instance, there's a $700 million project with the United Nations for batteries. Now, in Green Priorities, we talk about all the time about how batteries are not necessarily our friends when it comes to an actual energy transition, energy independence on a purely material basis. Like, do batteries actually help us practically, or are they just like, do they have enormous costs, for instance, in producing them that massively outweigh whatever they end up charging, such as an energy a Tesla or a renewable car. So that's one thing. The projects ensure that many Indigenous peoples are getting co-ownership on, if they even get meaningful co-ownership. Let's remember that many Indigenous peoples are quite skeptical of the fact that non-Indigenous companies are coming in, giving a small percentage of the ownership of the project to Indigenous in order to receive the necessary approval. But not only that, the reality is that the market is going to skew the things that get built, and markets like batteries. Right, this is a critique we see of Carney. Actually, it's a critique that Dr. Peterson regularly repeats, but it's not necessarily a right-wing critique. It's a critique of the sort of net zero economy. We've seen it in the European Union as well. And in so many ways, the reason why the net zero economy is kind of maybe a bad idea in so many ways is that even if you can come up with some of these green technologies like batteries, they're so skewed in that we can sell the idea of green, but once you look into the details materially, it's completely corrupted. And so unfortunately, I feel as if simply integrating Indigenous peoples into the consultation process in the specific case simply means still promoting what the market wants, and if the market and therefore we're still in the old framework of growth through consumption, or if that fails, growth through increased financial power and financial ownership.
Well, I mean, this to me, like in a lot of ways, kind of harkens back to the sort of 2015 2016 leftist point, which is the sort of like the push for maybe on the center left, the Hillary Clinton take of more female CEOs. And of course, the leftist response was no more CEOs, basically. And so yeah, that's kind of the difficult thing with this stuff, and that you know, you have a hard time talking people out of it. In terms of you know, I know even in my life there are people who have seen the transition of Elon Musk from this sort of, you know, liberal leftist darling. I mean, he was, you know, met with Obama, and he, I think I think in the first election voted for Hillary, in fact, and was kind of a vocal supporter. To obviously what's happened. I mean, this gets into more of his personal life, in my opinion. Um, but that ultimately, you know, even if he had sort of stayed the path on the left, I think we almost would have ended up in the same place that we are now, where, you know, Tesla becomes this highly financialized vehicle. His net worth is totally tied up in these markets and predictive markets, um, because ultimately, you know, the cost of making a huge lithium battery for an electric car. I mean, people talk about this all the time. It's that if you buy your Tesla, you'll have to drive it for whatever it is, 10 or 20, 25 years to offset the cost of if you had just driven a gasoline powered vehicle, basically. Um, but you know, that materiality again is something that doesn't necessarily matter to markets and to people who sort of set the tone and set the narrative in this way. And that's the same thing with the indigenous peoples. Is, I mean, you know, it doesn't need to be repeated that historically they've just had the worst deal of all time, and that any way to pay reparations, or to get them to a better place, obviously you're in favor of. Um, but if that way of life ultimately, you know, keeps the majority of people trapped in that same cycle, where, you know, the only way to have growth is to, you know, consume more, which means, again, in capitalism, which is you know, these markets are based on trading. It has winners and losers. There will be a new loser every single time, um, and in a competitive space like this, you know, that's sort of just the kind of thing that for me, I don't like the idea that society is based on a competitive nature, is based on winners and losers, is based on people who are able to take and turn it into more at either great, you know, personal risk when it doesn't pay off, and that someone else, you know, takes a huge hit when it does pay off. For me, is not the way that I see, you know, structuring the way that we run our country, and society as a whole.
Additionally, I mean, you know, organizing competition is itself a kind of societal or social uh, goal. It's not something that I think just it happens innocently or neutrally. The technical organization of, like, you know, can you have positive competition is itself like an extremely social philosophical point. Um, I remember once someone said to me, "You're only an individual in community," which is a good explanation for how these things kind of balance out. And I think that what you see primarily in markets is a fiction of competition, right? I mean, we've reached the point where all of the quote unquote competition in financial markets is synthesized itself by massive amounts of monetary printing. Now, we shouldn't focus on the monetary printing there, which is again a classic right wing talking point, though there's of course deep truth to it. What we should focus on is how we're synthesizing an economy out of thin air, right? The right should be the most sensitive to the fact that capitalism has never worked better than right now. It's astonishing that anyone argues otherwise. Stock markets have never been stronger. What people don't want to accept is that the stock market, unfortunately, is all that is left of capitalism once you take away any vague yearning towards industrialization or towards you know, forms of social security that we have had in the past, wage security, retirement security, pension security, all of which have broken down, and their institutions as well. In other words, if you want competition, if you actually want to talk about competitiveness or people, it's generally underscored by a tremendous feedback of working togetherness. In other words, it's a false opposition. And what you see in the competitiveness in markets, and again, no more than in markets which, well, if we're not even selling batteries, what we're going to sell is we're going to sell the idea of the battery, and that's what happens. It's, I mean, in some respects, markets maybe don't even have to do with competition. It's sort of even worse than that. it's not even a question of, sort of total market control or pure market competition where things are fair. The question is, what are markets even generating productively, right? And I think that financial markets for me represent not just the core of capitalism, but they represent that point at which capitalism um, ceases to reveals that it doesn't actually create anything like products, whether it's batteries or bookcases or
Hmm.
even financial derivatives. Um, what it maintains is actually the fiction of exchange and the fiction of transaction. Um, as a side note, a really interesting story was reported in the Globe today from the history of Alberta, and it kind of illustrates, I suppose, why organizing social goals is so difficult politically and philosophically. And there was a movement called the Social Credit Movement in the 1930s, and they sort of rose to power in 1935 in Alberta. And anyone who's familiar with the politics that currently reigns in Alberta, in particular the politics that reigns on the right, will be familiar again with the critique of the central bank, will be familiar with the critique of monetary printing. This idea that the central banks are flooding the world economies with money, with in order to fund governments that simply want to spend on policies that are not good for business, but simply good for quote unquote socialist policies. What, of course, is underestimated, as we've repeated many times, is that there is an unholy alliance between central bank monetary printing and the madness of financial markets or of the private sector. It needs an enormous amount of money because they actually don't produce industrial goods in the same way so as to sustain anything like industrial growth. But this movement, on the contrary, it was Alberta based and was deeply a political response to the conditions of the 1930s, the global conditions of the 1930s, the 1929 crash, of course, and the Dust Bowl. But because of the boom and bust nature of agro commodity markets in Alberta, they required a very different kind of financing from what was on offer in Toronto and Montreal in the 1930s. So they wanted the expansion of a credit system that would include Alberta farmers. And the reason why those in Toronto and Montreal did not want this is because they did not want a central bank to fall in the hands of Ottawa. They did not want a politicization of the money supply. Now, what's funny is the opposite now has happened. Now, financiers in the private financial sector absolutely want central bank control of the money supply, so long as the central bank is in the hands of a government that completely submits to the global stability of markets, the global stability of money. So, I mean, central banks are technically apolitical. Their only real remit is to focus on target inflation and keep it down. Um, but of course, the entire system itself is corrupt. Even inflation is a system that regularly re-engages you with the threat of inflation. Right, it becomes um, the only available economic tool you have at the center of some of these neutral policy powers, such as in the central bank, whether you like it or not. But the other opposite thing that has occurred is, of course, that Alberta has completely shifted, and they do not see at all the power or promise of the use of a top-down central bank in order to address their social concerns, even though in the 1930s this was the argument. Of course, it was also the argument of the fascists in Europe, but also of the liberal New Democrats in the United States. It was across the political spectrum in the 1930s. There was a renewed interest following the crash, the last great crisis of capitalism in 1929. Before 2008, of course, there was this interest actually across the political spectrum in top-down involvement for economic and social policy. I'm not advocating we go back to that, but isn't it interesting that within the span of 100 years, there can be a total flip in the Alberta politic about what kinds of instruments they need in order to rethink and remake their society? So the final topic for today's episode is just taking another look at artificial intelligence in society. So, we see AI at the moment in our oil sands, we see AI in healthcare, we see AI in education in the form of consumer technologies like ChatGPT. In the oil sands, they use obviously they have a variety of AI technologies to help increase their production of oil, but they even have robots on site to perform inspections, particularly a robot called Spot. As well in hospitals, because of the increase in violence by people who are going and wielding weapons, seeking to maim and harm, they're starting to install AI detectors that you can basically keep all your change in your pockets. Um, though and the AI sensor will basically be able to detect in a much more intuitive way the shape of things and so on. And and finally, yeah, ChatGPT, which is basically resulting in, I think unanimously there's this consensus that it's resulting in the destruction of the education contract.
Hmm.
And for anyone who is interested, I just welcome anyone to go look up the statistics on this or just the information or the anecdotes. It is unbelievable what is happening, particularly, I mean, obviously it's happening in the public education system in high school in particular, but in university, right? Um, we've already seen in some respects that university is kind of like a glorified high school at this point. It's an unavoidable qualification if you want to work in any labor market. Um, but whatever you're looking at here, we can just sort of take the three examples I've given. What happens to an oil sand when there's no longer human labor involved? Once you completely automate the process, does it not call into question the social goal of our energy infrastructure? Right? I mean, economics is not just a way of resource management. As we've seen again and again, it's a kind of raison d'être. It's a reason to be for our societies. And once you take away the human element, the production of natural social information, once people are not there, you get a disconnect on the other side of things, which is, of course, the consumption side. Once the production becomes automated, why isn't the consumption completely automated? Why is there any information about consumer goods? We just what we will have. The only thing that our society will be able to reinforce is that, well, we need oil, we need energy. Who knows why we need it? You know, again, if we're not necessarily building good hospitals, good roads, good schools, if all of that has fallen to the wayside because automation has destroyed all of our labor and wage contracts, not to mention destroyed any concept of creative entrepreneurship, I think you get the kind of breakdown of both sides, production and consumption in the context of healthcare. I mean, it's a terrible thing that this violence is happening, and we need a reckoning around that violence. But it's also strange that once again there's the abdication of any human decision making around how to address this violence. Let's just automate the human to human relationship. In some respects, as we already did with security scanners, I'm not a luddite. I do like technology, but I also like human decision making and social processes. And um, there is a relationship between this violence and automation, I can assure you. And finally, yeah, the collapse of education is, I would say, it's the collapse of this pipeline. This pipeline from when you're born in a hospital with universal health care to then when you're in daycare, right, which is in modern Canadian society funded by the government or subsidized heavily by the government, to then you go to public education, and then you go and you get your degree and you join the labor market and you have social security and you have unemployment insurance and you're paying into your retirement pension. Every single one of these has broken down. Every single one of these metrics is broken down, and the institutions behind them have broken down. I promise you that AI will replace economics,
Mm.
and it will be like a kind of apocalyptic replacement, because the only good form of economics that we've perhaps ever had was this giant social safety net. And I don't know if there's any going back to that giant social safety net. The only way in Canada, the only possible proposal we've been given is, okay, let's have huge national projects. Right, so this goes back to BC, but again, it's back to Carney's Canada as well. Huge national projects that maybe can get back wages, good forms of growth index to actual productivity. I think that even this form of economics, no matter how progressive, will have a hell of a fight against artificial intelligence. And even if we were to renovate and reinstall this kinds of progressive economics, I firmly believe that even the question of growth is totally misaligned right now. That economics as an instrument of human decision making is totally misaligned. And if we needed any evidence, look at the one index that consistently is ignored, which is, of course, is environment. whether it's in AI and whether it's going back to Ford Special Economic Zones, Carney's modular housing, or the BC Premier's plans with energy infrastructure. Even if they're emphasizing renewables, it's still a massive increase in consumption. And yeah, the environmental cost remains huge, and it should be the ultimate barometer for us
Mhm.
for beyond our economic technologies when we're not necessarily interfacing with reality anymore.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw that the report just came out that basically sea levels rose much higher than they were expected to this year. We continue to see extreme weather events, and we lack the infrastructure for it. I was wondering, I think the big argument that some would make for this is, let's take the oil sands for example, is if we're able to automate all of these jobs and we're able to basically get rid of them, that money that's saved will somehow find its way back into society, or we will have better jobs. Those jobs will turn into people who train AI or maintain AI, maintain the power plants, these kinds of things. But to me, there's a few arguments against that, which is one, um, basically anytime anyone who owns a business is able to save money, it's very rarely reinvested, especially as you said, we move away from sort of traditional economics, and markets are sort of all over the place and super volatile. There's just less incentive to reinvest anything versus just totally hoard it. I mean, this is what we've seen. The concentration of wealth is absurd at the moment. Though that concentration of wealth obviously is, as we've mentioned many times, intimately tied to things that are not real wealth, are not real money. Additionally, the value of money is less. But I digress. The to me, there's not a lot of reinvestment going on. Two is that there is almost a certain limit to those jobs. I mean, you think about how many people actually work at OpenAI, and it's not that many. For every 5 jobs that AI replaces, I don't think that 5 or 6 jobs will be created to maintain it. This is this weird inverse growth where it's actually almost worse. The best version of this is a thing that financially doesn't actually make any sense. So I don't think that is ever going to happen. And that also, we have to decide what we're optimizing for. I mean, that's the thing that people don't understand. I think that they think that, it might be controversial. I don't know. And there are a lot of experts. There are a lot of people that have their full PhDs that are so concerned about safety and super intelligence. To me, it still seems like a total fantasy. It totally seems like something that doesn't exist, will never exist. And I think that it's important that people remember that it is trained on specific data sets by specific people. There are checks and balances. There are weights. And that ultimately, if you can imagine a super intelligence that does sort of know everything and optimize for everything, I think ultimately it optimizes basically for nothing. And that's sort of where I maybe am a little bit in line with the super intelligence people. To me, it doesn't look like, I don't know, the Matrix or a bunch of Iron Man suits flying around killing everyone. But ultimately, if you were to feed everything into this system, there is essentially no point to all of this. I mean, it would say, wow, less people, less houses, you use less energy. Ultimately, you then actually do get the environmental view incorporated in, but in the worst possible way. I just don't see this going really anywhere positive if we're not going into it with the right sort of idea of how society should be run. The only positive I can say about some of those things with the education and its use by people is that if it's possible to pass a university level course with AI written essays, there has to be an investigation of what that university course was facilitating in the first place, and what it actually grants people. Because I think for a long time, it's been quite obvious that you sort of jump through a number of hoops, you get a piece of paper that lets you jump through a number of hoops, which I know maybe sounds like the back of the class stoner fuck school kind of attitude, but I think in a much more real way that really is the truth. I think even people that are in the midst of it, maybe more than anyone, understand this outside of a few specialized things. I mean, you can look at maybe law or medicine, something like that. where of course that training is really necessary. Um, but that's my thing with this AI is that unfortunately it makes perfect sense for a student to do that. They're like, well, I just need to sort of read this play and have sort of a cursory analysis of it that sort of uses the correct rubric and uses the right words and the right structure, and then I'll get the mark and then I'll get the degree and I can get the job. Um, so if there's a tool that exists that does all of that for you, then why would you not use it? If the rubric is optimized for something like that, it doesn't actually really reward anything that's particularly creative or particularly insightful or adding on to anything, then I think they're totally justified in doing so. And the fact that the rest of that contract has broken down, that they know that this degree might not even get them a job, even if it does, it won't allow them for much social mobility. You can get a job in Canada that pays $100,000 a year. You'll probably still have to live at home with your parents if you want to save for a home at this point. Um, and that your social security is always in question. If every other part of that has broken down, then isn't someone sort of in the middle of it totally justified in their end of the contract also breaking down? I mean, why would you put in all that work? Why would you spend all of your time? You are the AI of your life. You're the super intelligence of your life. So why would you optimize for this thing that is not optimized for you? And so I think that these sort of the boomer critique of people are lazy and people are stupid, is totally false.
And I think the situation with AI simply is properly apocalyptic. And I'm not trying to fearmonger, but there is a collapse of meaningful economic information once you install AI. That's why I think there's meaning to saying that AI will replace economics itself. I mean, before the collapse of, growth in real wages in the 70s and really the collapse of post-war growth itself, you could maybe describe the hoops that people had to jump through as good hoops, even if you kind of had to do it.
Mm-hmm.
There was, as you said, there was the guarantee at the end of that pipeline that you had a job, that you had Social Security, that you had universal health care, that you had retirement savings at the end of it. And what's interesting is that when you introduce enormous amounts of automation into an economic process, it invalidates the need for economics. And therefore, it invalidates the need for the social um, paradigm of transaction and of exchange. And even if exchange and transaction as economic disciplines or forms of life have broken down, and this, of course, is one of the big things that we've just, as a society, refused to acknowledge, that there was a point where even our nice, good Social Security contract wasn't working anymore. And there's lots to be said about why that was, but it did break down, and we could no longer support wages with good industrial growth without, say, at the same time, massively expanding consumption in ways that started to tip the scales, and people were not simply being lifted out of poverty, for instance. And there was this kind of middling of economic productivity and growth, which resulted in the slowdown of the 1970s. But people who fantasize about this automation are basically, in my mind, the only candidate for actually, communists. It used to be an idea, fully automated luxury communism on the left,
Mm-hmm.
that we'll automate it, and then everyone will not have to work, and we'll have the best society ever. And what's funny is that capitalists, financialists, people who are obsessed with AI, seem the most inclined towards building a society on this principle of full automation. But what they ignore, what they repress, is that there will be, again, a breakdown of the meaningful information on which you would then have a society, on the other hand, that is simply automating for us. The social meaning, in other words, of our production will basically collapse the moment human beings are not involved in it. And this might sound like a very abstract idea, but again, think about the total collapse of standards that happen with the use of AI. They can produce a good imitation of human engagement. But not unlike the collapse of standards under the great neoliberal project of the last 50 years, right? In our schools, in healthcare, right? Once the funding collapses and you get the most sterile product, the most sterile society, sterile infrastructure. Well, AI is certainly on much more on the side of sterility because it doesn't have a body with which it can engage in reality. And therefore, once you automate energy, automate food systems, the automation removes the social information. And then you don't really have productivity anymore that is informed by genuine, I would say, human wants. Instead, what you get is what you already hinted to, an AI that will tell us what we want. And I think one shouldn't say, oh, now let's get paranoid about the possibility of a totalitarian artificial intelligence. It'll be much worse. It will be a kind of bad totalitarian intelligence. And maybe this is the sort of a really important, maybe concluding point worth underscoring, is that, as you already mentioned, AI is built upon, it's being fed through human culture, through the human internet, which means that, there is one other hallucination which is worse than artificial intelligence hallucinating fake information, and it's the fact that human beings hallucinate all the time through language. And it was possible for us to build a society on the basis of economics, even though I'm convinced that economics basically does not work in the final analysis. So what's scary, and this is what I would say is properly apocalyptic, is that artificial intelligence will work. It won't work because it automates anything and we actually have a coherent society on the basis of that automation, or because it will know what human beings really think in that kind of Stalinist sense. It will work because we'll simply replace every possible meaningful and coherent social institution, first with economics, and then, having dumped all the good social institutions, which were admittedly tied to economics, will then become dependent, if not outright addicted to AI, which is already happening massively. And then we'll have so few options about how to even negotiate politically what the next step is. In order to have a politics, you have to have texture with which to negotiate, right? Again, in the explosion of that change in the political spectrum, whether you're on the right or the left, post 1929, that explosion was extraordinarily important, right, to generating radical political alternatives. Not only did that not happen in 2008 or in pandemic for that matter, which was another huge financial crisis and a giant social crisis, now with the crisis of AI, we're not transitioning. It's worth mentioning that Pope Leo XIV named himself Pope Leo because the last great Pope Leo XIII, wrote at the end of the 19th century about the conditions of the working class in the Industrial Revolution. And the current Pope wanted to be named after that Pope, Leo, because he felt that we're undergoing a similar Industrial Revolution with AI. And if there's any indication of just how fundamental the change will be, go look at the environmental cost of keeping open data centers and artificial intelligence. It is an energy cost that will dwarf the entire energy cost of human society itself, as if we needed any more indication for the kind of apocalyptic paradigm shift that artificial intelligence represents.
This has been Radical Priorities, episode 25. I'm Ben Parkins.
I'm Aidan Clark.
Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.